Hey, what's going on everyone? This is Bunny Muffins. Today we're going to go over best in slot items for every single champion in TFT right now. If you're wondering which items are mandatory on each champions, which ones are optional, which champions you want to put support items on, which unit should hold Shrouds, which unit should hold Zephyrs, Zezirot, Zeeks, etc., this is going to be the video for you. We're going to be starting off with the tier 1 units and then going all the way down to 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's just get right into it. So starting off, we're going to do the top left first. This is generally how I'm going to categorize it. Top left is going to be the tank units. Top right is going to be the melee damage units. Bottom right AP. Bottom left AD. And then the middle section is kind of everything in between. It's not going to be sorted out perfectly, but we will be going over every single champion. So let's start off with Leona. Leona is a Mirage and Guardian, so Guardians really like health a lot because they turn their health into a shield after they get to 50% health. And sometimes Leona is played as a solo or duo tank. That's why I like items such as Gargoyle Stoneplate on her, I like the Warmogs to get more Guardian buff value, and I also like the Ionic Spark because her ability makes her tankier, so if you have a damaged tank item such as Ionic Spark or the Sunfire cape that you see on Nasus, it's generally going to be good to put on these champions that purely only do tanking, because they're not providing anything much else, so you get that extra value from the item. Next up, we have Nasus, pretty similar items. You have the Ionic Spark because Nasus does some magic damage himself, Sunfire Cape because he's really tanky, and you kind of want him to do a little more than just tank. It also gives a bunch of bonus HP, which is good for Guardian, and then lastly, Protector's Vow. Protector's Vow kind of does the same thing as the Guardian trait. It gives a shield, but this one is AoE, so it's whoever is within 2 hexes, so this is all really good combination on Nasus, though I will say we have not seen Nasus carry quite yet, so use him as an item holder in the early game. Next up, we have Malphite, Sejuani, and Skarner. So all three of these champions, these are going to be your Zezirot holders. The reason why is because they just are not good solo or duo tanks. So you're going to be using them as like kind of your third tank or your off-off tank. So you don't want to dedicate too many items to them. Luckily, there's an item that exists that makes you tanky without committing a tank item slot on some of your main tanks, because you might be using a tier 4 or tier 3 unit for that purpose. This is what Zezirot's for. It just gives a ton of health when they die and spawn, and that's just really all you can ask for from these 3 units. The reason why Malphite and Skarner like this so much is because the tankiest bruiser right now is going to be Sylas, and Sylas is only a 3-cost unit, so you need that extra Zezirot on his off tank to really help out your team to buy more time for your damage dealers to deal damage. Sejuani, she's often played with either Hecarim or Nunu, kind of similar stories, but she's just the least tanky Cavalier, so that's why she's on Zezirot duty. Now let's go to the top right with some of the damage short-range carries. Let's start off with Wukong. Wukong is in a bit of a weird spot. In previous sets, there were a lot of reroll Wukong builds, and they were built very similar to like how I have on the screen here. We're just going to have to wait for a patch where Wukong gets buffed before we whip out this item combination. So maybe you're watching this in the future, hopefully this build is viable now. But the best build for Wukong is RFC, Runons, and Deathblade. The reason why you want this is because he's a warrior, so you want to take advantage of his attack damage. And the best way to do that is Deathblade. Deathblade is really good on reroll units because it gives more attack damage based on the champion's star level. After that, you want Runons because Runons is the best complementary item to Deathblade because it essentially attacks a second target. Lastly, I like rounding him off with a rapid fire cannon. This gives him much needed safety so he's not in the front row, and he'll be doing a lot of bonks from the back there. People like to call him Bonky Kong. After that, we have Set. We saw a bunch of Set reroll in the last set, and his best build, the 2 mandatory items are Quicksilver and Rageblade. This allows him to really ramp up. Third item would be Deathblade because he's just attacking really quickly, so you just want more attack damage to kind of magnify that. But you could replace this with something like a Titan's Resolve. Now let's go on to a Mage in Vladimir. Vladimir is a great item holder in the early game. I wouldn't really think he's going to quite be a solo reroll carry, but he can be great for item holding for tank items and for mage items, which is what makes him really useful. So you could kind of give him the in-between items that both do damage and tanking, such as Titan's Resolve, Ionic Spark, and Sunfire Cape. They kind of do both of the same thing. They give a little damage, they give a little tankiness, and he is the perfect holder for all of these items. Now let's go on to the AP carries in the bottom right here. So Talia, not going to be a main carry most likely because there are too many other good mages right now. But if I had to itemize her, I'd probably do something like Spear of Shojin, Jeweled Gauntlet, and Infinity Edge. Who knows, they might buff her numbers up a lot to the point where reroll Talia could be viable. Same story with Karma. The difference between these two units is their mana pool. Talia has 60 mana and Karma has 50. So the way to know whether you want a Spear of Shojin or blue buff is you need to count how many auto attacks it takes for them to cast their ability. So normally without any mana items, you generate 10 mana per attack. With a Spear of Shojin, you generate 15, so with 60 mana, it takes Talia 4 auto attacks to get her cast off. Coincidentally, she has the same amount of cast needed with a blue buff. However, the one difference is that Spear of Shojin grants an additional 20 bonus ability power, which really helps her getting more damage. Karma, on the other hand, likes the blue buff because it takes 3 auto attacks to cast her spell, because blue buff gives you 20 mana after each cast. Compare that to Spear of Shojin, where you'd need 4 auto attacks. Blue buff is just clearly better in this case. I like the Jeweled Gauntlet Infinity Edge combo. I think it's the highest damage combination for casters in the game, and unless you really need something like a Morello or an Archangel to stack up later on, this item combination just has too much power, which is why I also build it on Ezreal. Ezreal's a bit of a special case though. Notice how I put him in the middle. Even though he likes ability power items if you were to solo carry him, he works as a great item holder because he uses both AD and AP items effectively. If you want to stack him with the items you see on Senna and Nidalee, he would do perfectly fine if you're just using him as an item holder. So essentially, that makes Ezreal probably one of the most critical early game units because he just holds every item so well. Next up, let's go into Nidalee. If you're doing a Nidalee Shapeshifter reroll, which is sometimes viable with Astrals, you can do something like Deathblade to give her more attack damage because she's going to be 3-starred, Rageblade so that she ramps up her attacks, and then Runons to complement the Deathblade. You could also add in a healing item such as Hand of Justice or Bloodthirster if you don't have any healing from your augments. One thing to keep in mind for itemization is that you need 4 things for each champion. You need damage, damage amplification, increased frequency of damage, and healing. So to get pure damage for attack damage, you want obviously attack damage. For ability power, you need ability power, and then for amplification, for both damage types, damage amplification can be granted through stuff like Critical Strike or Giant Slayer bonuses, and then as for increasing the frequency, casters like getting mana, and attack damage champions like getting attack speed. Lastly, we need healing, but sometimes you could get that from an augment, so if you see a carry that doesn't have any healing items, you generally could get something like that from an augment. Notice how I said before Wukong can take some different items, sometimes that could be a Bloodthirster as well. Now let's move on to Senna. Again, there's no Senna reroll comp quite yet right now in the meta, but she's a great item holder for all attack damage items. Rapid Fire Cannon's great on her because she's a Cannoneer, same with Last Whisper because she's purely attack damage, and then Giant Slayer is nice to hold on to if you're really focusing one of the tanks. Keep in mind for all 1-cost units, some of them I pointed out that their builds are for using them as a reroll as a carry, but most of them are going to be your item holders in the early game. Now let's move on to 2-cost units. This is where it gets a bit trickier. Starting at the top left, Braum is another one of those dedicated tanks, so he's going to use 1 or 2 tank items and then 1 or 2 utility items. So his tank item is going to be the Stone Plate because he can often be used as a solo tank. Redemption is good for healing other people or himself, and it gives him a little more utility because his ability only helps him in terms of tanking. And then Sunfire Cape does the same thing, provides more utility for your team other than just being a meat shield. Zac is another dedicated Zz'Rot holder. You could argue that he could hold Sunfire Cape or Morellonomicon because he attacks in an area, but in a lot of the Lagoon builds, which is where he's primarily used, he's often put on Zz'Rot duty. Next up is Rel. Rel is really good because she gets a 3rd item from the Darkflight trait. So that means you only need to put maximum of 2 items on her. For now, I'm liking the Sunfire Cape and the Protector's Vow because again, she's mainly just a tank, so it allows you to provide some utility for your team, and she's often not used as a main tank because there are better Cavaliers later on in the game, such as Nunu or Hecarim. For all 3 of these units, feel free to put stuff like Shroud, Zephyr, and other similar items on them as well. Next, let's go into the kind of the middle zone of the melee units. That's going to be Jax and Gnar. Jax is going to like a lot of tank items, despite often being known as like a damage unit in League of Legends. In TFT, his ability allows him to stun units in an area around him, so that means you just want to focus on tankiness, and using just any 3 generic tank items will do, but I like putting him on the edge because, again, he stuns within an area of effect. So I like giving him tank items that benefit from him being focused, such as Gargoyle Stoneplate. Winter's Approach is also pretty good because he will be put below 50% health first compared to your other tanks if he's on the very edge of your front line. Next up we have Gnar. Gnar is a shapeshifter, so he really benefits a lot from health, and he also does a bit of damage. That's why I like Sunfire Cape and Warmogs, because it just gives him a lot more health. Sunfire Cape also has the added benefit of burning the people after he jumps into the fight. And then lastly, Titan's Resolve gives him both a mix of tankiness and damage. Now let's move on to the top right. Yone is going to be one of the only melee carries at 2 costs. So if I were to build him, Rageblade is probably the only mandatory item I'd say on him. And of course you need some sort of healing. If you're not getting it from an augment, you'd want it from a Bloodthirster. And since he's melee, a lot of melee carries like Quicksilver Sash. You notice that we put it on Set before. We're going to put it on Yone now, but you could just go 3 damage items instead and kind of protect him in other ways, such as second rowing him. Next up we have Lilia. Lilia's kind of a weird unit because she doesn't really have that much of a spot in the game right now. She's really just used because she's a trait bot, because she's a Scale Scorn, Cavalier, and a Mage. But if you do manage to get a 3-star Lilia, she could do some funky things. It's just not going to happen so often. What I like to build on her is something like a Titan's Resolve because she needs both the tankiness and the damage, Ionic Spark because she does magic damage, and something to heal her up so that she could keep stomping the ground every single time. Next up we have Kiana. Kiana is the perfect support unit in the game. She gives stuns, she's got decent traits, and you could move an assassin anywhere on the map and they're always going to go to a similar spot. So that's why I really like having Zephyr on assassin support units such as Kiana, because you could literally move her anywhere and she's always going to do some work. So same reason why I like putting Shroud on this unit. Now let's go into the ability power carries. First we're going to start off with Lux. Again, Lux has 60 mana, so I'm going to go with the Spear of Shojin on her. Next, she's a mage, so she casts twice whenever she casts, so that's why items such as Jeweled Gauntlet are really good on her. Without an Infinity Edge is really good on units that cast a lot of times during a fight, and you're not super reliant on the first cast. If you are reliant on the first cast, you definitely need both the Jeweled Gauntlet and the Infinity Edge. But since Lux is a mage, she casts twice, she's not one-tapping anyone. I like going with the Archangels to stack up damage, and the Jeweled Gauntlet just for increased damage amplification. Next up we have Kaisa. She's kind of in a weird mix right now. She's a really good Morello applier, and she also makes use of Static Shiv really well because she's a Lagoon unit. Lagoon units get both ability power and attack speed from the trait, so that's just the perfect recipe for having a Static Shiv. Next up is Rageblade. It allows her both to cast faster and to proc Static Shiv more often. But if you don't have a Static Shiv, you could go full ability power on her and get something like a Blue Buff or Spear of Shojin. Both allow her to cast after 3 auto attacks. Next up is Zyra. This is a funny case as well because right now the main build on Zyra is actually an attack damage build. So what people like to do is go Rageblade, Rageblade, Runons, and the reason why people do that is because the Whisper trait give Whisper units stacking attack damage and ability power every time they damage a shrunken enemy. This is why this build is really strong on her, but you could build her ability power as well. Maybe they change how Whisper works with her in the future. Next up we have Twitch. Twitch is an attack damage carry, and he's also a swift shot, so he loves pretty much whatever Xayah likes because he can be used as an item holder for her or for Varus. So that's going to be Rageblade, Deathblade, and Runon's Hurricane. Next is Aphelios. Aphelios was really popular in the last patch, and what Cannoneers really like is Last Whisper and Runons because they deal a lot of attack damage, so both of these items really just amplify pure physical damage teams. Next up is Rageblade just to get them to attack more. That's going to be it for the 2 cost. Let's move on into the tier 3 units. So this one actually has a ton of units right now and a lot of weird ones in the middle. Let's start off with the tanks though. Silas, we talked about him before when we looked at the 1 cost bruisers, but Silas is going to be your go-to bruiser tank. There really isn't any other bruiser that's quite tanky like Silas. So in order to do that, you want to build a lot of the solo tank items. Gargoyle Stoneplate is really good. You could even go double Gargoyle, you could go Dragon Claw, but you could also go Ionic Spark because you often play him in mage comps because he is a mage. Next, because he's a bruiser, he has a bunch of health. Winter's Approach is pretty good to give a big shield to your whole team. Next up is Nunu. He's one of the main Cavalier tanks. His ability allows him to deal bonus damage if enemy units are lower health than him. So that's why you like stacking health such as Warmogs and Sunfire Cape. Both these give bonus health. Lastly, Redemption heals for a percentage of your missing health, so it really complements this bonus health, and it also heals units around Nunu. Rakan is a great example of a utility item holder. The reason why is because he's never going to be in the front line being your main tank, but he's a really good unit in general. And because he's ranged, putting on something such as a Zephyr or a Shroud of Stillness makes it so you can kind of place him almost anywhere on the map, not quite as freely as you would a Kiana, but close enough. Lastly, you could also just put him on Zizzirat duty. Now let's go into the middle here. So Lee Sin, he could be built as a pure tank, or he could be built as pure damage. The pure damage build I have right now is Hand of Justice plus the Jeweled Gauntlet plus the Infinity Edge. Whenever you're running Infinity Edge or a critical strike build in general, Hand of Justice is really good because it gives additional critical strike, which in turn leads to more damage because of the way Infinity Edge works. It also gives him both damage and healing, so that is just going to be the best build for damage Lee Sin. If you're building him as a tank, almost any generic tank item can work. You could use Warmogs, Redemption, Sunfire Cape, Titan's Resolve, anything of that nature. Next up is Volibear. We have not seen too much reroll Volibear yet, but I do suspect something is going to happen for him in the future once he gets buffed. So in order to do that, you want healing from the Bloodthirster, Quicksilver because he's a melee carry, and Rageblade because he needs to ramp up. Now onto Zippy. For some reason there's no image for him, but for all the Zipsters out there, right now his best in slot build is going to be Bloodthirster, Titan's Resolve, and Rageblade. He's just going to be stacking pretty much the entire fight. On a lot of dragons, Titan's Resolve is going to be really good because they just have more health than other units, and they're going to be allowed to stack up all the way to 25 stacks, which gives the most value to this item. So whenever you could get max stacks on a unit, it's almost always going to be a really good item on them, if not the item is just underpowered. Next, let's go into Diana. Diana could fit in some reroll builds, otherwise she's kind of used as a support unit, so she could hold stuff like Chalice of Harmony or Zeke's Herald. But if you are doing a carry Diana, Infinity Edge is really good because she's an assassin. Assassins love that item. Ionic Spark because she does magic damage, and Hand of Justice to complement the Infinity Edge while also giving healing. Now let's move on to the top right where we have Olaf. Olaf is a typical melee carry. Since he's a warrior, Runons is going to be really good because it gives additional attack damage and also shoots the Splitting Bolts, which is buffed up from his attack damage as well. And every time he dies, he gets even more attack damage. So he's just one of those guys who just really needs damage amplification more so than just raw damage. That's why we do not build stuff like Deathblade on Olaf, although he could still sort of use it. Next, we need some healing because he's melee, so Bloodthirster is perfect for that. And in the last spot, you could put either a stacking item, you can put in an additional damage item, you could put something like a Quicksilver on him because he's in the front line. Pretty much any of those options will do. But Giant Slayer is also really good just because he's often attacking tanks in the front. Next up, we have Rengar. He's another assassin similar to Diana. So we're going to put the Infinity Edge Hand of Justice combo on him. And also, since he does attack really often and has decent attack damage, I'm going to put the Runons on him as the last item. But this could almost be anything that gives him more attack speed or attack damage. Now onto Namzi. This is where things get a little complicated because Namzi has 3 different versions. For the Cannoneer version of Namzi, I like having Rageblade, Hand of Justice, and Runons. The reason why is because he's a Cannoneer, so he benefits a lot from attack damage, and also you still want him to cast, so the attack speed helps a little more than something like a Deathblade. Lastly, giving him a tiny bit of healing is nice, and he also makes great use of both attack damage and ability power when he's in Cannoneer form. Now let's go into his other versions. As an Evoker, he does primarily ability powered damage. He's also going to be having a lot of mana regeneration, so you don't really need to build stuff like a blue buff or a Spear of Shojin, though it wouldn't hurt him. So that's why I like to focus more on pure damage items, such as Jeweled Gauntlet, Infinity Edge, and Archangel Staff. If you want to put a healing item on him, you could put something like a Hextech Gunblade. A lot of people wonder when you should build Bloodthirster and when you should build Hextech Gunblade. Typically, if they are taking a lot of damage, you want the Bloodthirster because it gives them the extra shielding. So it's more of a dedicated lifesteal item. However, if you're a backline carry that doesn't take that much damage like a Namzi, using something like a Hextech Gunblade is a lot more valuable because it heals other people on your team. That's why the backline units for healing, they generally like Hextech Gunblade or something like a Hand of Justice because it doesn't give as much healing as the Bloodthirster. Of course, it's not the end of the world if you have either or, because again, it's just something that's really needed, especially if you don't have any healing from augments. Now let's go into the Mage Namzi build. Mage Namzi build is pretty similar, but we do want some mana regeneration. Namzi has 90 mana, that means Spear of Shojin's going to be the best mana regeneration item. 90 divided by 15 is 6, so he needs 6 auto attacks in order to cast his spell. Next up for damage, you could use stuff like Archangels because it kind of takes a while for him to cast, or you could use raw ability power such as Rabadon's Death Cap, or a healing item again in the form of Hextech Gunblade. Let's go back into the other units in tier 3. Next up is Seraphine. Seraphine loves mana regeneration because she just wants to cast as many times as possible, and then Morellonomicon is really useful on her. So the way Seraphine works is that her ability gives a shield to her teammates and gives them bonus damage per attack. So you might be wondering, hey, that ability doesn't do any damage, so why would I put Morello on them because Morello only triggers on damage? Well, it actually triggers off of your allies' attacks, so she's actually one of the best appliers of this item. Next, because she shields your units, she really likes Archangel Staff because her fights are going to be going into the long game. Next up, we have Zeri as a Cannoneer. There aren't quite any Zeri builds yet, but I do feel one coming into the future once they buff her a little bit, and since she's a Cannoneer, she again likes the typical Cannoneer items of Runons and Rageblade, and then lastly, Giant Slayer is pretty good because it amps up both her physical and her magic damage, because she kinda does both. But honestly, a lot of different items work on Zeri, and my favorite healing item on her is going to be the Hand of Justice, because again, it buffs up both her stats. Next, we have Varus. Varus is a swift shot, meaning he has a really high attack speed. And since he's an astral unit, you can get him to 3-star more reliably than other tier 3 units. That's why I like having the Deathblade on him, because he is going to hopefully be 3-starred and make the most use of the item, and then Runons and Rageblade to get more value from the Deathblade after that. Now let's go on into the tier 4 units. This gets a little more interesting because we have some of the more iconic dragons. Let's start off with Idis. Idis is almost too tanky for his own good. That's why you really want utility items on him. I'd say the best items for Idis is maybe 2 tank items and 1 tank utility item. So the utility item could be something like a Sunfire Cape, it could be an Ionic Spark if you do magic damage, it could be something like a Redemption to heal your other units. You just need anything on him that kind of gives a little bit more than just pure tankiness. Hell, even like a Bramble Vest is really good because it does damage to the enemy team. The best tank items for most dragons is going to be the Dragon Claw. The reason why is because Dragon Claw gives bonus effects on dragons, so you just get a better item than when you use it on anyone else. Again, Idis is going to be mainly a solo tank, so both Stoneplate and Dragon Claw, which both benefit from more units attacking them, is going to be really crucial on Idis. Next up is Xiaoyu. Xiaoyu is weirdly enough both a tank and a damage carry, but people are primarily using Xiaoyu as a damage carry. Therefore, you want stuff that amps his damage, which is going to be Bloodthirster, Edge of Night, and Titan's Resolve. So Edge of Night is really good because it allows him to get a lot more survivability, so instead of building something like a Quicksilver Sash, you actually just Edge of Night instead, and just deal many more auto attacks, allowing you to heal back up really quickly. Titan's Resolve is really good on pretty much every dragon, again, because you just can guarantee getting all the stacks all the way up. Next up we have Hecarim. Hecarim is the best Cavalier, don't get me wrong, but he's never really used as the main tank because there are a lot of good Cavalier units, so whenever you play Cavaliers, you might run 3 of them, sometimes even 4, and they kind of split all the tanking duty. Although he is the most expensive Cavalier, he's still going to be pretty useful with stuff like a Winter's Approach, with stuff like a Warmogs. Warmogs is really good for Cavalier units because Cavalier trait gives resistances, and pretty much that just means that they need more health because that's how you get the most effective HP. I could show you guys the math, but I do so in another video. So check out this video for advanced tips in TFT, and I believe I talk about it there. Next, I like getting a little utility on Hecarim, and sometimes since he is a Rage Wing, you are looking for units like Shyvana, but let's say you don't get Shyvana in your game, who can hold the Morellonomicon for you instead? Hecarim's a great user for that because he often ults into their backline, so he actually applies Morello to everyone important on the enemy team. Lastly, Protector's Vow is pretty decent because it just complements Warmogs pretty well, and since you're running a lot of different tanks, you're almost guaranteed to hit your other tanks with this item. Now let's move on into the kind of pseudo damage and tank units in the middle here. That's going to be Pantheon, Swain, Siphon, and Jace. Starting with Pantheon, his best item is Titan's Resolve because he loves stacking. He's a Whisper unit, and his ability pretty much gives him a lot of stacks of almost everything, mainly Whisper stacks. So with that in mind, Getting Titan Resolves on him just amps that up even more because he gets his stacks for free and he's in the front line. And then the Bloodthirster allows him to stay alive throughout almost the entire fight if they don't have a lot of burst damage. You could also use other tank items such as Warmogs so he doesn't get cut off before he stacks all the way up. Next up is Swain. I'd say the mandatory item on him is Morellonomicon. It's just way too much value on this champion because he just attacks such a big radius. So he's just a really good user of that item. And then because he's also a dragon and often a solo tank, Dragonclaw and Stoneplate are a no-brainer as well. Now onto Siphon. Siphon is mainly used as a damage unit, but I have seen him be tanky if you're using a different Whisper carry or a different Bruiser carry. He uses very similar items to Xiaoyu with the Bloodthirster, Edge of Night, and Rageblade. Almost any attack damage or damage amplification item will work on Siphon. You could use stuff like Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, all that good stuff as well. And also some of the other healing items such as Hand of Justice work quite well too. Base is in a weird spot. He's supposed to deal ability power damage, but right now his best use is as a tank. If he is really good with ability power, I would recommend just building stuff like Ionic Spark, Archangels, and Jeweled Gauntlet, because since he is a unit that can both tank and deal damage, he's often going to live pretty long for building up the Archangel stacks. Ionic Spark is obviously really good too because he's going to be in the fray. But if you're playing him primarily as a tank, Titan's Resolve is really good, Sunfire Cape is great for applying a healing debuff on the enemy team, but you could also use Morellonomicon. And lastly, since he is a shapeshifter, he does get a lot of health, so having something like a Protector's Vow is really good because the bonus you get is based off of a percentage of your health. As for melee carries, there's really only Nyla in tier 4. Edge of Night is probably the most important item on Nyla because sometimes you just don't want her to die randomly to a random spell because she's always jumping around all over the place. Since she's an assassin, Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice combo comes back again, so that's really all there is to it for Nyla. Now for the bottom right dragons, the AP carries. Weirdly enough, all the AP carries are dragons, all the AD carries are 4-cost units. So starting with Sohm, blue buff is super important. This is probably the most mandatory item for Sohm. And Morello is also really mandatory too, but blue buff, because Sohm is a Lagoon unit, so you want to cast as often as possible in order to get more Lagoon stack. Morello's really good because he doesn't quite kill anything in the first couple of casts, so you just want to apply a healing debuff to the whole enemy team, and then Archangels for stacking so he could finally finish them off in the later part of the fight. Deja's a bit weird. Deja can almost use any item, just because he's kind of like a weird stacking type of mage that deals damage from both attacking people and from casting his spell. So that's why Rageblade and Archangels are really good for him, and then amplifying them up is just really good with the Giant Slayer. I prefer this over pure AP or pure attack speed builds because again, it just gets the best of both worlds for Deja, but it does also depend on the Mirage variant. For example, on Duelist Mirage, Rageblade becomes less important because you already get a lot of bonus attack speed from the Mirage trait. Next up is Graves. Graves is kind of weird because he dashes into the enemy team to deal his shotgun damage. That's why it is very important to have these first two items you see here, which is Edge of Night and Bloodthirster. Remember how I said a lot of the melee carries prefer Bloodthirster over stuff like Hextech Gunblade? That's because they're in the fray a lot, and you really just want to be greedy with the heal, and you don't really need to heal your allies. It's more important just to keep your carry alive. And both Edge of Night and Bloodthirster do exactly just that. For damage, Runon's is going to be really good because, again, he's a cannoneer, he has a lot of attack damage. You're going to get a lot of value from the splitting bolts. Now onto Xayah. Xayah is a swift shot, so she gets a lot of attack speed, but because of the way her feathers work, you still want the Rageblade on her anyways. Last Whisper is really good because she attacks tanks a lot, and then Giant Slayer for the same exact reason after that. Now onto the tier 5 units. If you guys have made it this far already, and you found a lot of the information useful, do be sure to drop a like on the video below so it could reach other TFT players, and help me out as well. And if you have not already, do subscribe below because I come out with a lot of guides every couple of days. This one is really weird because there are no attack damage 5-cost carries, so that's why they're sorted in this weird way. Sorry, what I mean is like range attack damage carries. But let's start off with Terra in the top left. This is the tankiest of the tanks in this TFT set right now, and it even buffs up your other tanks. So as a dragon, Dragonclaw is gonna be really good on Terra. Gargoyle Stoneplate, Terra is often used as a solo tank. The tile is in the center where Shyvana is right now, so you just want to drop Terra there most of the time and just be a solo tank for a lot of your dragon teams. And these items are just really good for that. You could even have duplicate copies of them instead of the Warmogs, but sometimes you want the Warmogs to increase your effective health because Terra gains a lot of resistances, both from the items you see here and from Terra's ability. The reason why Terra does not have a lot of the utility tank items such as Ionic Spark, Sunfire, and the likes of that, it's not because they're bad on Terra. They're still very playable, but typically when you use Terra, you already have big guns in the backline such as an AO Shin that doesn't really need any help killing the enemy team, so you just really need to survive to buy time for your AO Shin. That's why Terra's built this way, and that's why some of the other tanks that use kind of like the half Z items. Next up is Shyvana. So Shyvana is really weird because the itemization for her is different when she's 1-starred and 2-starred. However, I never bank on getting a 2-star Shyvana because that is just really rare in TFT, and if you get it, no matter what items you have, you're going to be doing well. So you want to focus on itemizing her as if she was a 1-star unit. So the best items for that is going to be Ionic Spark and Morellonomicon. These two are very important because she does mainly magic damage, so Ionic Spark gives a lot of value, and she attacks in an AoE, often in the backline, so applying a healing debuff is really huge for that. And then lastly, hopefully she casts a bunch of times, so you could put in an Archangel Staff as the last item. But if you have something like a Rabadon's Death Cap or a Jeweled Gauntlet, you're not really angry about that. You could also put in a tank item for Shyvana in the 3rd slot too. Something like a Warmogs because she's a shapeshifter is pretty good, or something like a Titan's Resolve can give her a lot of value as well. Now, I know what you guys are asking. What if I do know I'm going to get her 2-star? For example, if you have 2 champion duplicators and you already have a Shyvana, you're going into the Dragon Treasure loot and you just want perfect items for Shyvana, well honestly just going triple Rabadon's Death Cap, she'll wipe everything off the board, or do something like Rabadon's Jeweled Gauntlet Infinity Edge if you really want to just 1-tap a lot of teams as 2-star Shyvana. You could still keep the Ionic Spark when you do that because it's still really useful on her, but maybe you could skip the Morellonomicon and the Archangel Staff. Next up is Yasuo. Yasuo is really weird because even though he's an attack damage carry, his itemization is incredibly weird. Blue buff is incredibly good on Yasuo because you want him to cast as often as possible so he gets that giant AoE whirlwind that CCs entire enemy teams. That's why blue buff is really, really good on Yasuo, but not a lot of people do it because whenever you're going for like a comp that's like a Mirage or Warrior comp, you don't really build blue buff. So this is great for taking off of like the last carousels if you just see a random blue buff there and you are already running a Yasuo. Next up, since he is a melee unit, getting stacking items that give him more damage such as Titan's Resolve is really good. And lastly, Edge of Night helps him live a lot longer. Now we get into the biggest damage dealers of the set. That's going to be AO Shin and Aurelion Sol. So let's start off with AO Shin. He really needs mana regeneration. I hope I said that enough times. Spirit Shojin is almost required on him. Like, don't even try running him without this unless you have 10 other ways to get him mana. I don't even know what that would be, but AO Shin with and without a Spirit Shojin is just the biggest difference in the world. If you magically get an AO Shin 2-star and you just can't get a Spirit Shojin, what should you use instead? You could use something like a Guinsoo's Rageblade to get him to cast faster, but that's pretty much the only other alternative. For damage, I like Archangels because again, he takes so long to cast, so you get a lot of Archangel stacks, so it's really good. And then lastly, for healing, Hextech Gunblade, he does so much damage that he does not need a Bloodthirster. So Hextech Gunblade heals your Terra all the way up to full health as well whenever AO Shin casts. Now, if you do have healing from an augment, you don't need this, so you could just add another damage item instead. Or you could get him to cast faster with something like a Static Shiv, Rageblade, things like that. Now, since your AO Shin's going to be alone in the backline a lot of times, if you are facing assassins, if let's say in some magical world in the future, assassins are meta, everyone's playing assassins and AO Shin's getting wiped out really quickly, Edge of Night is a very interesting choice to play on AO Shin because it protects him because he becomes untargetable, and he also gains attack speed after the fact, so it does help him cast faster. So if you're ever in one of those weird assassin metas but you're still playing AO Shin, do something like Spirit Shojin, Edge of Night, and then either a healing or damage item as your third. Next up we have Aurelion Sol. Aurelion Sol's an evoker, so he doesn't really need the mana regeneration like AO Shin does because he gets it from one of his traits. So what you want instead is just damage and healing, and the best way to do that is just Hextech Gunblade, Archangels, and Jeweled Gauntlet. You could also do the Jeweled Gauntlet Infinity Edge build, both are fine on Aurelion Sol. Now let's go on to the last 3 units of the game. These are probably the weirdest units to itemize because They don't really do anything and they don't really need any items. However, they still benefit from some of the stats. So before, when we looked at a lot of the support units, they use stuff like Zephyr or Shroud of Stillness, but those are kind of wasted item slots on these champions. I'm not saying I wouldn't put those items on these champions. I'm just saying that there are better support items for them because they do benefit from both ability power and attack speed because their effects and spells are really powerful. You just don't need to buff them up directly. So getting something like a Zeke's Herald is really good on all three of these champions because it just helps them cast faster. Putting on a Chalice of Harmony helps them cast faster too because you give them the tier. And they're just really good units to buff up your other backline carries because that's what's going to be dealing most of your damage because all three of these guys are support units. So Bard gives a big AoE CC, and he also amplifies the damage of your team after he does that, so Static Shiv's really good for that, both for giving him mana and attack speed and magic resist reduction. And also a lot of teams in TFT use Static Shiv as an early game item, and you're like, oh, who do I put it on in the late game? Because if I'm running like a Xayah, I don't want to put a Static Shiv on her if you have these three items instead. So you could put on stuff like Bard, Zoe, or Soraka. Zoe, same thing, but she is really important to cast a lot because she's a mage, so she casts twice. And despite being a mage, and despite thinking that she might do a lot of damage, she really doesn't. She only has one ability out of 4 that does damage, so putting stuff like Jeweled Gauntlet on her is almost useless. If you do have to put ability power on Zoe, only do something like a hat, because it's going to give you a ton more value than something like a Jeweled Gauntlet. But Zoe likes casting a lot because she provides a lot of utility for your team. She gives your team a lot more tanks with Daisy ultimate. She makes your team invulnerable with Kael's ultimate, and she does still have the Lux damage spell, but my favorite one is the Janna Tornado because it just CCs the entire enemy team. Soraka, she's great for healing your team. Again, you just want them to cast fast and hold your support items, so pretty much same exact 4 items that you can put on all 3 of these champions. That's going to sum up what you should be building on every single champion. Do keep in mind, I do differentiate between different reroll builds versus just using them as an item holder. That's especially true for the 1, 2, and 3 cost units. But let me know down in the comments what items you like to put on your favorite champions. And now that you know how to itemize every single champion, you need to know what playstyles to use when you're trying to climb in TFT. And I have a video that will help you right here. It goes over the top 5 playstyles that I like to use. So definitely go check that out right after this. And hopefully I will see you in the next video. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.